It took them exactly 24 hours. On April 2nd, a $100 million organization dropped a report designed to brand Burkina Faso's leader a war criminal. By April 3rd, Traoré stood before cameras and said what no African leader had said out loud in decades. Democracy is slavery. Imagine a war room, not the kind with guns, the kind with press releases, wire transfers, and media contacts on speed dial, where the decision to bury a leader is made before breakfast. Where a carefully timed document, funded by the world's most powerful financial networks, lands like a precision bomb, not on a city, but on the news cycle, deployed to detonate before he could speak, engineered so that by the time Africa heard his words, the verdict was already written. He spoke anyway. 15 years ago, the NATO launched over 9,700 strike sorties against a country that had the highest standard of living on the African continent. Today, that country, Libya, is an open-air slave market where Black African migrants are sold for as little as $400. That is what exporting democracy actually looks like on the ground. Now look at Burkina Faso. French investors just lost $1.2 billion in annual gold revenue when Traoré nationalized 5 mines last year. His government launched a $64 billion national development plan. He achieved food self-sufficiency for the first time in his country's modern history. There are $64 billion reasons why the democracy cartel cannot afford to let him finish what he started. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who funded the organization that attacked him. You will see the moment France physically arrested an elected African president and called it defending democracy. And you will understand why what Traoré said on April 3rd is not just one man's opinion. It is the most dangerous sentence in African politics today. The story was simple, too simple. A military leader in West Africa, a young captain who seized power in a coup, was refusing to hold elections, dissolving political parties, and silencing all opposition. And now, according to a major international human rights organization, his military forces had killed more than 1,800 civilians since 2023. That was the story. That was the version running across Al Jazeera, CNN, RFI, and BBC Africa, all within 48 hours of each other, all citing the same single source, all arriving at the same prepackaged conclusion. Ibrahim Traoré was a dangerous authoritarian who needed to be isolated, condemned, and removed from power. And then, the very next morning, he walked before cameras and handed them exactly what they needed. People need to forget about the issue of democracy. We have to tell the truth. Democracy isn't for us. Democracy kills. Perfect timing, convenient even. The narrative was already locked before the words left his mouth. Dictator rejects elections. Dictator rejects democracy. Dictator silences opposition. Dictator's forces kill civilians. The democracy cartel had its headline. The story was written before the story happened. But let's slow down. Let's look at what Traoré was actually responding to, not the edited 30-second clips, not the breathless Twitter threads designed to generate outrage before you've read a single paragraph, not the push notifications engineered to tell you what to feel before you've had time to think. Let's look at the full context that every major international outlet quietly left on the cutting room floor. On January 29, 2026, Burkina Faso's government formally dissolved all political parties by presidential decree. Over 100 parties, gone. Assets seized and transferred to the state. All political activities suspended indefinitely. The Western media response was instant and coordinated. Democratic backsliding, authoritarian consolidation, another African strongman crushing opposition. The word dictator appeared in headlines within hours. The framing was so uniform across outlets that it almost seemed drafted in advance. What those headlines did not explain What they systematically refuse to explain is what those 100 political parties actually were. Before the 2022 coup, Burkina Faso had one of the most fragmented and dysfunctional political landscapes in West Africa. Dozens of parties existed as patronage structures, mechanisms for elite groups to access state resources, distribute foreign NGO funding, and protect their own factional interests. They did not represent ordinary Burkinabe citizens. They represented access to the state treasury. And Burkina's population understood this clearly. 80% of the country lives in rural areas, many in communities under active jihadist insurgency for over a decade. These were people who watched government after government make promises in Ouagadougou while abandoning them to die in the countryside. Consider what was happening under the democratic governments that preceded Traoré. By 2022, Islamist armed groups linked to JNIM and the Islamic State Sahel province controlled or actively contested more than 40% of Burkina Faso's national territory. Entire provinces were functionally cut off from the capital. JNIM fighters were blockading food supply convoys, starving civilian communities deliberately, systematically, as a military strategy. Schools were shuttered across the north and east. Villages were burned. Children were being forcibly recruited into armed factions. The state had collapsed in everything but name across vast stretches of the country. And the Democratic parties, all 100 plus of them, were holding conferences in Ouagadougou about institutional norms, issuing carefully worded statements for foreign donors, and collecting per diem payments while the people of the Sahel were being slaughtered. That is the system the democracy cartel calls democracy. Then came April 2nd, 2026. Human Rights Watch, one of the most widely cited organizations in international journalism, with offices in over 90 countries and an annual budget exceeding $90 million, released a 94-page report titled Burkina Faso, Crimes Against Humanity by All Sides. Findings: Burkina Faso's military forces and affiliated militias had killed more than 1,800 civilians since 2023. Al Jazeera ran it. CNN ran it. RFI ran it. BBC ran it. Reuters ran it. The Associated Press ran it. 6 of the most powerful media platforms on earth, all amplifying the same document, all using the same framing, all reaching the same conclusion within 24 hours. The next morning, April 3rd, Traoré gave the most provocative speech of his entire leadership. The democracy cartel had its weapon. The sequence was precise. Report on day 1 establishes Traoré as a criminal in the International Court of Public Opinion. Speech on day 2 becomes evidence of his dangerous anti-Western extremism. Days 3 through 13, 10 days of wall-to-wall coverage dissecting democracy is slavery as confirmation of everything the report had already proven. The sequence was choreographed. 1 document, 1 speech, 10 days of globally synchronized media coverage. This is what information warfare looks like in 2026. Not propaganda posters, not state radio broadcasts, press releases, funding cycles, editorial timing, publication dates selected with surgical precision. The democracy cartel does not need soldiers to destroy a leader's credibility. It needs to make sure that by the time he opens his mouth, the world has already decided what he is. But there is one thing every single one of those reports left out entirely. Something buried in the funding records of the very organization that published that 94-page document. Something that changes the entire architecture of what you just watched unfold. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The organization's name is Human Rights Watch. Its annual budget exceeds $90 million. It employs over 500 staff across offices in New York, London, Brussels, Nairobi, and dozens of cities worldwide. Its reports are cited by the United Nations Security Council, the European Parliament, and the U.S. serve State Department as primary sources when making decisions about sanctions, foreign aid, and diplomatic pressure. When Human Rights Watch publishes a report, governments listen. When Human Rights Watch labels a government's actions crimes against humanity, that designation follows that government into every international forum, every bilateral negotiation, every development funding conversation for years. It is not a casual label. It is a weapon, one of the most precise and durable weapons in the modern geopolitical arsenal. It doesn't explode, it suffocates, slowly, systematically, with the full endorsement of every international institution that treats NGO reports as objective truth. So the question you must ask, the question that almost nobody in mainstream media will ask, is this: who funds Human Rights Watch? And what are their interests? Here is what the public record shows. In 2010, George Soros, through his Open Society Foundations, made the single largest donation in Human Rights Watch's history, $100 million. $100 million distributed over 10 years. In a public statement at the time, Soros described the donation as an effort to expand HRW's presence in regions where he believed significant gaps existed. He specifically named Africa and Asia. $100 million to fill gaps in Africa. Ask yourself what kind of gaps a billionaire financier, one of the most politically connected investors in the Western world, with deep ties to European financial institutions and U.S. foreign policy networks, was interested in filling on the African continent. What kind of Africa reporting serves the long-term interests of global capital? What kind of African leadership creates the kind of problem that requires a $100 million investment in human rights monitoring to solve? The answer becomes obvious once you see it clearly. Leaders who nationalize foreign mining assets. Leaders who expel French and American military forces. Leaders who tell the IMF that their populations will not be held hostage to debt obligations negotiated in Paris and Washington on terms that serve creditors, not citizens. Those are the leaders who create the gap. Not a gap in reporting, a gap in control. And the solution is not aid. The solution is a narrative that destroys their legitimacy before they can consolidate real economic sovereignty. This is how the democracy cartel operates. Not through tanks, or through reputation. The pattern repeats with mechanical consistency. A leader emerges who threatens Western financial control over African resources. An international human rights organization publishes a damaging report timed to coincide with a key political moment. Western media amplifies the report as objective, independent journalism. Diplomatic isolation follows. Economic pressure is applied. And if the leader resists long enough, if the narrative alone is insufficient, the next step has historically been military. But if you think the HRW report against Traoré was new or original or isolated, you have not been paying close enough attention to the continent's history. Because the democracy cartel ran this playbook before. They ran it in 2011, and what happened next should be required reading for every African alive. His name was Laurent Gbagbo. Gbagbo was the elected president of Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. In November 2010, he ran in a contested presidential election against Alassane Ouattara, the Western-backed candidate with deep ties to the IMF. The results were disputed. International observers, operating under significant French diplomatic pressure, declared Ouattara the winner. Gbagbo refused to accept the outcome, citing credible evidence of fraud in specific regions. What followed has been almost entirely erased from the mainstream Africa narrative. France, the former colonial power that had maintained military bases in Ivory Coast since independence, launched what it publicly called a peacekeeping operation. French Licorne forces armed with attack helicopters and operating under United Nations Security Council mandate then began striking positions held by forces loyal to the sitting head of state. French helicopter gunships fired on the presidential compound in Abidjan. French military personnel coordinated directly with Ouattara's rebel forces as they advanced on the capital. On April 11, 2011, French special forces entered the presidential residence. Laurent Gbagbo, the sitting head of state of a sovereign nation, elected by his own people, was physically seized and arrested by the military forces of France. France arrested an African president. They called it defending democracy. Think about what that means. An elected African leader who refused to step down under foreign diplomatic pressure after a disputed election was removed from office by the armed forces of his country's former colonial master. The international community applauded. Western governments normalized relations with Ouattara within weeks. Human Rights Watch issued statements praising the outcome. The world moved on. That is how the democracy cartel defines democracy when applied to Africa. The result they prefer, delivered by whatever means are necessary, wrapped in humanitarian language designed to prevent any serious examination of what actually happened. And then there is Libya. In the same year Gbagbo was being arrested in Abidjan, NATO launched Operation Unified Protector over Libya. Over 9,700 strike sorties. Bombs and missiles targeting military infrastructure, communication systems, and state institutions of a country that, whatever one thought of Gaddafi's governance, was functional, self-sufficient, and sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in Africa. Then the stated reason was protecting civilians. The real context was more complex. Gaddafi had been actively proposing a pan-African gold-backed currency, the gold dinar, that would have allowed African nations to price oil and natural resources outside the dollar system. He was financing African Union infrastructure. He was working to reduce French economic dependency among former colonies. He was building a continental vision for African financial sovereignty. Libya in 2010 had the highest Human Development Index score on the African continent. Its GDP per capita exceeded $12,000. Healthcare was free, education was free, housing subsidies were provided to every Libyan citizen. By 2021, Libya's GDP per capita had collapsed to $6,018, exactly half of what it had been before NATO liberated it. And by 2017, when CNN cameras documented open-air slave markets operating on the outskirts of Tripoli, actual footage broadcast globally of Black African migrants being auctioned to the highest bidder for as little as $400. Human beings sold. In the country, the democracy cartel had bombed into freedom. This is the documented record, not theory, searchable, verifiable, on camera. When Traoré said, "Democracy kills," and pointed directly at Libya, he was not being provocative for the sake of a headline. He was citing evidence. He was presenting a data point that the entire Western media apparatus had been trained to ignore, contextualize away, or bury beneath diplomatic language about complex situations and fragile states. He was being precise. But the man who signed the $100 million check to the organization that published that April 2nd report had a very specific reason to keep Burkina Faso quiet, and it had nothing to do with human rights. It had everything to do with what is underneath the ground there, the gold. That is what is underneath the ground in Burkina Faso. Not oil, though there is that too. Gold. Billions of dollars in gold, scattered across dozens of concessions that, until very recently, were controlled almost entirely by foreign corporations headquartered in London, Toronto, and Paris. In June 2025, Traoré's government completed the nationalization of 5 major gold mining assets. The transfer included operational mines previously held by Endeavour Mining and Lilium, among the most profitable gold producers in West Africa. That the state-owned entity that absorbed these assets, Sopamib, now controls mining rights generating, at current gold prices, over $1.2 billion annually. French investors reacted with fury. Industry publications described the reaction in careful language. Significant uncertainty, investor confidence concerns, challenging operating environment. The polite translation was stark. Hundreds of millions of dollars in annual profit that had been leaving Burkina Faso and flowing into foreign accounts for decades across every government, every election cycle, every democratic transition was no longer going to leave. That is what a 94-page Human Rights Watch report was published to stop, not civilian casualties. The democracy cartel has never prioritized civilian casualties in Africa. Not when France was bombing Libya, and not when the United States was occupying Iraq. What they protect is not people. It is the asset class, the resource base, the extraction infrastructure, and any African leader who moves to reclaim that infrastructure must be discredited before the model spreads to the next country, and the next, and the one after that. Because Burkina Faso was not acting alone. Mali had already nationalized key components of its mining sector. Niger had expelled French nuclear operators from its uranium mines, the same uranium that had powered French nuclear reactors for decades, purchased at prices set entirely by France, generating enormous value for the French economy, while Niger remained among the world's 5 poorest countries. The AES was not just a military alliance, it was an emerging economic sovereignty movement. And the democracy cartel understood that if Burkina Faso succeeded, if the gold revenues funded the development plan, if the development plan delivered visible results, if the visible results inspired other nations, the post-colonial extraction model would face an existential threat. This is the context in which Traoré walked in front of cameras on April 3rd and said what he said. He was not reckless. He was not emotional. He was making a precise, historically grounded argument that the Western media apparatus, by design and by instruction, stripped of every piece of context before broadcasting it globally. Here is what he actually said in full. People need to forget about the issue of democracy. We have to tell the truth. Democracy isn't for us. Democracy kills. Look at Libya. It's a prime example right next to us. Everywhere they try to establish democracy in the world, it's done with bloodshed. Democracy is slavery. Read that carefully. He did not say governance doesn't matter. He did not say accountability is wrong. He said the specific version of democracy that Western powers have been imposing on African nations, using international organizations, foreign funding, and military force when required, is not a system of self-governance. It is a system of external control dressed in the language of freedom. And he used Libya as his evidence, not as an abstraction, as a documented case with measurable outcomes that anyone can verify. He was correct. And while the democracy cartel was building its global narrative about what he said, they were completely silent about what he was doing. In December 2025, Traoré's government announced that Burkina Faso had achieved food self-sufficiency for the first time in the country's modern history. The agricultural offensive, launched in 2023 with almost zero international media coverage, had systematically expanded cultivated land, mechanized farming operations across previously inaccessible regions, increased access to subsidized inputs and improved seeds, and organized artisanal producers into formal cooperatives. A country that had been dependent on food imports and international humanitarian aid for generations was feeding itself. That is not a press release. That is an infrastructural transformation delivered in under 3 years, while simultaneously fighting an active jihadist insurgency across 40% of the national territory. In March 2026, Burkina Faso launched its National Development Plan, $64 billion allocated over 5 years across infrastructure, energy, agriculture, education, and healthcare. one of the largest nationally financed development programs ever proposed in the Sahel. The government also signed a separate $1.16 billion food systems transformation program with the United Nations, not as a recipient of charity, but as an equal partner directing investment into communities defined by its own government. In parallel, revenue from the nationalized gold mines went directly toward reducing Burkina Faso's domestic debt. By early 2026, the government had cut that debt by 25%. It is also worth noting this. By January 2026, Ibrahim Traoré had survived at least 5 coup attempts and assassination plots since taking power in September 2022. 5 documented attempts in under 4 years. The democracy cartel does not rely solely on narratives when narratives prove insufficient. When a leader cannot be discredited, the next option has historically been physical removal. Each foiled attempt was another data point in the same equation. Someone with significant resources and operational reach was working to ensure that Traoré did not get to finish what he started. The fact that he was still standing, still governing, still nationalizing, still building, was itself a statement more powerful than any speech he had ever given. On April 1st, 2026, 1 year after the proclamation of the Progressive Popular Revolution, Traoré presided over anniversary celebrations across the country, thousands mobilized in the streets. He announced the imminent publication of the Revolution Manifesto, a comprehensive ideological document outlining the strategic direction of Burkina Faso's transformation across every domain of national life. He was constructing a framework, a documented, durable vision for what sovereign governance looks like after colonialism ends. The democracy cartel dropped their report the following day. They had seen this playbook before, the one Traoré was running, the leader who builds real things, who delivers visible results, who speaks in terms the population understands because the terms are their own lived reality, who constructs a coalition that cannot be dissolved by a single diplomatic phone call. They had seen that playbook in a man who tried to build exactly this kind of continental sovereignty before them. And Traoré had seen their playbook too, not in a textbook, in a country that no longer exists the way it once did, a country that once had the highest GDP per capita on the entire African continent. You already know its name. Step back. Widen the frame. Because what is happening in Burkina Faso is not an isolated story about one leader, one coup, and one televised speech. It is the visible edge of a continental tectonic shift, one that was decades in the making and is now accelerating faster than any Western foreign policy apparatus had calculated. Start with France. Over the past decade, France has been expelled from or forced to withdraw from more than 70% of the African countries where it previously maintained a military presence. Mali expelled French forces in 2022. Burkina Faso expelled them in 2023. Niger expelled them the same year. Chad forced a renegotiation that reduced the French military footprint to near zero. Senegal, Ivory Coast, and the Central African Republic all requested departures or restructured terms that fundamentally dismantled the post-colonial security arrangement. Today, France's entire military presence on the African continent amounts to approximately 1,500 soldiers in Djibouti and a small garrison in Gabon. That is the full remaining legacy of France-Afrique, the entire post-colonial architecture of military influence, economic dependency, and political manipulation that France constructed across its former colonies beginning in the 1960s, reduced to 2 garrisons on the periphery of a continent of 1.4 billion people. This did not happen by accident. It happened because of leaders who decided the arrangement was no longer acceptable, and those leaders needed a new structure to replace it. In September 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed the Liptako Gourma Charter and formally created the Alliance of Sahel States. the AES. Initially framed as a mutual defense pact, within 12 months it had evolved into something more ambitious. A full confederation with shared governance institutions, a common passport initiative, a unified military command structure, and, critically, its own financial infrastructure completely independent of France and the IMF. In December 2025, the AES launched its unified military force in a ceremony in Bamako. 6,000 soldiers, single command structure, headquarters in Niamey, Niger. And the force was expanded from its initial 5,000 to 6,000 in February 2026 in direct response to escalating jihadist operations, but its political significance exceeded its military one. Three nations that had been deliberately kept fragmented, underfunded, and played against each other for 60 years by colonial powers were now fielding a joint army under a shared flag and a shared doctrine. Then came the AES Confederal Investment Bank, the BCID-AES. A financial institution designed to route development capital through AES-controlled channels, independent of the IMF conditionalities that had for generations forced African governments to cut social spending, privatize state assets, and maintain fiscal policies designed in Washington rather than in Ouagadougou, Bamako, or Niamey. Independent, critically, of the CFA franc. The CFA franc is one of the least discussed and most consequential colonial instruments still operating in the world today. 14 African nations, most of them former French colonies, remain tied to a currency pegged to the euro and managed in coordination with the French treasury. For decades, these nations were required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves directly into the French treasury, 50% of their own money, held in Paris. The arrangement has been partially reformed in recent years, but the structural dependency it created, monetary policy shaped by European interests rather than African development needs, persists. The AES Investment Bank was a direct institutional challenge to that arrangement. Not a speech, not a statement, a functioning financial structure. I now add the geopolitical dimension. When France was expelled from the Sahel, a vacuum emerged, and the vacuum did not stay empty. China surpassed Russia in 2024 to become the largest exporter of arms to sub-Saharan Africa. Chinese weapons are now flowing into Burkina Faso and Mali at a scale that defense analysts describe as a fundamental rebalancing of the regional security architecture. In January 2026, Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships conducted joint naval exercises off the coast of South Africa, the most explicit demonstration yet that a new multilateral security framework for Africa is operational, not theoretical. Russia's Africa Corps, the successor to the Wagner Group, has deployed approximately 2,500 personnel to Mali alone. In early 2026, Russian forces helped repel a significant militant assault on Niger's international airport. This is not Russia controlling the Sahel. This is the Sahel choosing its partners based on who will operate on African terms rather than against them. In February 2026, China eliminated import duties for 53 African nations, every country on the continent except Eswatini. Duty-free access to the world's second-largest economy for 53 countries simultaneously. The economic architecture of the post-colonial order is being dismantled, not in conference rooms, in trade agreements and arms deliveries and banking structures. In January 2026, the United States, watching this realignment with growing alarm, announced an expanded travel ban targeting citizens of AES nations. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger responded the same day. They invoked the principle of reciprocity and imposed their own travel restrictions on American citizens. Three of the world's financially poorest countries looked at the most powerful nation in history and said, "If you ban our people, we ban yours." In March 2026, the European Parliament passed a resolution on the AES, using language that the alliance characterized as political interference. Traoré, now serving as AES chairman, having assumed the rotating chairmanship from Mali's Assimi Goïta on January 1st, responded personally, calling the resolution serious interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. All three heads of state signed the formal rejection. The Confederation spoke with a single voice. That is the world Traoré was speaking into when he said, democracy is slavery. Not a fragile moment, not a desperate gamble. A calculated statement from the chairman of a growing confederation of sovereign nations, backed by a unified military force, building independent financial infrastructure, and watching the colonial architecture that had dominated the continent for 60 years crumble on multiple fronts simultaneously. He was 36 years old, because the real question was never whether Traoré was right about democracy. The real question is, what happens to the next African leader who says it out loud? And what happens when this time the whole continent is already listening? Here is what the democracy cartel is counting on: that you will watch this, feel something, and then close the tab. They are counting on your silence. The Traoré named Libya. France arrested Gbagbo. Soros funded the organization that attacked him the day before his most important speech. These are not opinions. They are on the public record. They are searchable. They are verifiable by anyone with 10 minutes and a search engine. The silence around these facts is not accidental. It is manufactured. And the only thing that breaks manufactured silence is people who refuse to stay quiet. If this video told you something that the mainstream narrative has been hiding, drop sovereign in the comments right now. Not because it helps the algorithm, because it tells every other African watching this thread that they are not alone in knowing what they now know. Share this with one person who needs to see it. Not tomorrow, now. Because the window where this conversation can spread freely is closing faster than anyone wants to admit. We are the media now. Act like it.